Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our webinar, Implementing Complete Streets in Small Towns and Rural Communities in Vermont. I'm Kelly Stoddard-Poor with AARP Vermont, and I'm joined today by three fantastic speakers that will be talking a little bit more in depth about complete streets and what it means to implement complete streets in a small rural setting. Thank you again for joining us. We've got three speakers today lined up. We've got Emiko Atherton, who is the director of the National Complete Streets Coalition. We also have John Kaplan with VTrans. He is the Bicycle and Pedestrian Program Manager. Then we'll hear from Karen Horne, who is the Public Policy Director with the Vermont League of Cities and Towns. And I want to thank all of our partners for coming together in collaborating to bring this webinar to all of you. Also want to feature that we have the chat box in the left-hand corner of the webinar where you can put in your questions at any time to us. We'll be taking rounds of Q&A during two times during the presentation. We'll take a pause about midway through the webinar for some time for Q&A, and then we'll wrap up at the end for Q&A as well. As many of you are aware, Complete Streets is a philosophy and approach to planning, design, construction, and maintenance of our roadway network to consider all users, including pedestrians, bicyclists, and transit riders, motorists when designing our roads. We came together to really bring this webinar to you and to reach a couple of high-level objectives. A couple of the objectives that we'd like to get accomplished in this webinar is really to be able to share best practices within a rural small town setting. Talk a little bit about the benefits that Complete Streets brings, economic, public health, safety, and overall quality of life benefits. We'll also give you an update on the progress being made here in Vermont with Complete Streets, and then get a little bit more specific about the opportunities and tactics that are available for you in implementing Complete Streets. Before I turn it over to Emiko, I'd like to give you all a little bit of background in Complete Streets legislation. The Vermont legislature passed statewide Complete Streets legislation in 2011. This law requires that the needs of all transportation users, regardless of their age, ability, or preferred mode of transportation, be considered in state and locally managed transportation projects and project phases, which includes planning, development, construction, and maintenance. Regardless of the project's funding source, whether it be federal or state or municipal, except in the case of projects involving unpaved highways. So Complete Streets does not apply to unpaved highways. After consideration is given, if a state or locally managed paved roadway project does not provide for the safety and accommodation of all transportation users, the state agency's project manager or municipality's project manager, respectively, must make a written determination citing circumstances that explain why the project does not need to go forward. The exceptions that are outlined in the Complete Streets law are the three following. One, use of the transportation facility by pedestrians and bicyclists or other users is prohibited by law. Exception two is the cost of incorporating Complete Streets principles is disproportionate to the need or probable use. And the third exception is incorporating Complete Streets principles is outside the scope of a project because of its very nature. So not every street or road will be used by a wide variety of modes, but a Complete Streets approach considers all users and seeks desirable, practical, and affordable improvements that will be accepted by the community. Now I'm going to turn it over to Emiko Atherton from the National Complete Streets Coalition with Smart Growth America, and Emiko will provide a little bit more of real-life experiences and best practices when it comes to Complete Streets. Emiko?
Thank you so much, Kelly, and good afternoon, everyone. Again, you heard my name is Emiko Atherton, and I serve as the director of the National Complete Streets Coalition, which is a program of Smart Growth America. The National Complete Streets Coalition is the founding organization of the Complete Streets movement here in the United States, and we've been around since 2004, helping communities to adopt and implement Complete Streets policies. I will, give a shout out to AARP that when our name is has coalition in it because we've always been a really broad-based coalition. But one of our partners that has been around since day one was AARP. So I love how this relationship has continued to evolve and grow and get even stronger. And I know AARP believes in the benefits of complete streets because of how we are having a growing population of older adults who really are wanting and needing walkable, livable communities. I wanted to talk to you today about complete streets in small towns and rural areas. One of the reasons that I was attracted to so much to complete streets and the complete streets movement is that it really applies in all types of communities. But I think it has a special place within rural towns and small areas. A complete streets approach can provide really a more effective and balanced transportation system for the nearly 49 million Americans who live in rural areas and small towns. And what's interesting is, for those of you who are familiar with the Coalition's work, every spring we put out a report on the best complete streets policies of the previous year, and we tend to look at where those best complete streets policies are in terms of jurisdictions. And we've actually seen now a good fourth of complete streets policies are coming from communities under 20,000, and that actually the number of rural areas and small town complete streets policies is growing. I think that's because people can really take complete streets, communities can take complete streets and really make it something that they can own. It is not a design prescription, but really a changing philosophy to thinking about all users of all abilities. On top of that, I think there's also a lot of issues that come up that complete streets are really applicable to. Many of you might know that rural areas have some of the most dangerous incomplete roads in our countries. I'll show another slide later on in my presentation, but over 50% of traffic fatalities in the United States happen in rural communities, although rural communities only make up about 20% of the population. There's also accessibility issues that come in rural communities, lack of transit service, lack of sidewalks, just based on the character. Also needing to have healthy choices. When we work closely with the public health community and follow public health statistics, and we are seeing a growing rise in people who are living with chronic disease. The CDC came out with a report about a month ago that showed that 4 in 10 Americans are no longer just overweight, but they are obese. So 4 out of every 10 of us is obese. And we've seen that more prevalent in rural communities and small towns. But complete streets can be really sensitive to those rural contexts. We're not going in and saying, build Broadway, New York's Broadway in your main street. We're saying figure out solutions that work for you and that really articulate the vision of your community. And there have really been powerful ways to build up main streets as economic development tools, as places of tourism, as places of where people can gather and congregate. So those are some of the kind of the issues facing it. Other issues that rural areas and small towns face is that you're making longer non-local trip distances. So if I want to go from small town A to B, it's not like where I live right now, which is Washington, D.C., and I will bike around Washington, D.C., and it's very obvious. It's not obvious to me when I cross from D.C. into Maryland, because there are sidewalks that are continuous. There might be a bike lane. The corridors are spread out. Where in areas like Vermont, you're going to have these longer non-local trip distances. So you're trying to figure out how to really connect people within a community, and then connect people from community to community. I feel really excited. I woke up thinking about this webinar today, and what I was really excited is I've actually probably experienced more biking infrastructure in Vermont than most people. I spent a good part of August biking around Vermont by myself on a bike tour, and really got to experience the bike infrastructure in your small towns. And within many of your communities, you do have some really great cores. And depending on where I was going from community to community, I think it got a little bit more dicey, for lack of a better technical term. The slide showed on the right is actually from it's actually a slide of mine, and it is from outside of Breckenridge, Colorado, where a colleague and I were biking on roads that are very similar to yours in Vermont, these kind of rural, high-speed roads that connect town to town, and they'd actually paved their shoulder with red paint to really delineate that this was for cyclists. You also have health disparities. I mentioned that. There are also large income disparities within rural communities and small towns. I think some of our rural communities are facing some of the largest income inequality, and then there are higher crash rates. Other challenges that come up that are specifically unique to, I think, a lot of Vermont's rural landscape is you have agricultural uses, you have public land uses, you have built audio-oriented roadways, and those are going to look different depending on whether you are in a small town, whether you're in a town like Brattleboro, or you're suburban Burlington, which looks very similar to suburban Maryland, but they're really designed for the roadway in mind. Kind of a lack of transportation choices, and what I mean by that is most small communities don't have probably a transit system. Constrained terrain, so you're thinking about, it's not like in a downtown large city where you can have a big grid system. You're dealing with constrained terrain. You're also dealing with the terrain of your beautiful Green Mountains and other mountains. Safety. Your main street is often a highway, which makes large challenges, and I'm excited to hear John talk about this because your main street is actually not owned by your community. There's climate and maintenance. You deal with very snowy climates, and maintaining that is hard. And then the ongoing challenge that all communities face, which is funding. However, there are a lot of opportunities. I think, particularly in Vermont, you have some of the most unique characters that there are. You have a huge draw in tourism, which is a huge opportunity to take advantage of. You have very walkable cores or downtowns. There's a lot of opportunity for small business and economic development. I think, and there can be improvements to safety, and there's really even more ways to create opportunities for walking and biking. So what I wanted to do in the next part of this presentation is just share some examples from other small towns and rural areas that we've heard from that are doing good work on complete streets. One of the pleasures of my job is I get to really hear and see a lot of examples from all types of communities. The smallest community I've worked in was, which I'm not talking about today, was Halls, Tennessee, which has a population of around 2,000, and then last week I was in Chicago, Illinois. So Warsaw, Missouri is a town that we highlighted earlier this year in the Best Complete Streets Policies report because they've really done a lot, not to just have a really good policy, but to implement complete streets in a way that's setting up their community for success. So just for some context, Warsaw has a population of around 2,100. It was a very economically depressed area. It had a large growing older population. It had high rates of chronic disease. And while it was couched in some beautiful land within Missouri, residents had no way to access those natural resources. And the city, who had no prior experience with complete streets, really saw building bike and ped infrastructure and complete streets as an economic, livability, and health strategy. Just some more background on this is the city is unique because it's small, but it's also isolated. It's a rural community. And I should say this population wasn't already embracing or accepting bike or ped amenities. It was not a huge tourist destination, unlike many places in Vermont. But it was where the leadership, faced with this kind of economic and health crisis, decided they needed to do something. So they decided to work to make the entire city and region accessible through walking and biking by improving sidewalks, safe routes to schools, improved walkabilities in business districts, connections to key nearby recreational areas, and regional and national bike and pedestrian connections via the Rock Island Trail and U.S. Bicycle Route 51. And I just wanted to share some pictures that are courtesy of the Missouri Bicycle and Pedestrian Federation. So these are before and afters of what they chose to do in their downtown. And you can see on the left there's a really decrepit sidewalk and how they chose to build that back up to make it a really walkable main street. You can see the beautiful street lights and street trees, the awnings. Here they had a downtown harbor and park trail, and on the left you can see what it looks like before and how they really chose to build that up and make it a destination center. and then how they really embraced complete streets by putting in basic things like working with Safe Routes to School funding to put in sidewalk crossings, traffic calmings, the basics which are missing in most of rural Missouri, like these really, and then really for this goal of an entire city that was walkable and bikeable. And the results are, it's now the fastest growing area in the county. They're seeing their tourism expanding, which was non-existent before. They're seeing an increase in businesses, and they've seen a 12% decrease in childhood obesity. So this has really been a success story, I'd say, largely in part because the leadership chose to embrace this. They really, they looked at, we have a lot of ways that they could choose to address the economic depression and the health disparities and their aging population, but they chose that walkability and bikeability, and they're seeing their return on investment. The next example I wanted to highlight is out of Alexandria, Minnesota. So Alexandria, Minnesota is slightly bigger. Alexandria, Minnesota is around 12,000 people. Let me move on. And they have done really a phenomenal work on their main street, but also through coalition building to transform their downtown. So in the summer of 2010, the Active Living Douglas County, which is known as the ALDC Partnership, launched a complete streets visioning process for Broadway Street in Alexandria, which is their main street. And this process led to the development of a design to support walking and biking in downtown Alexandria and improve access to downtown from the Center Lakes Trail. This trail has an estimated 150 users a year, but those people weren't able to access Broadway Street in a way. So there were all these people who use these trails, these regional trails, and the city really said, we want to draw them into the downtown. We want them to stop for lunch. As someone who has just very recently biked to Vermont, I love that. You have a lot of rails to trails, and I loved it when in certain parts I would be steered off by wayfinding and a really safe way to get somewhere, because bikers are really hungry and we like to spend a lot of money on food. But kind of the way that a community chose to be connected to those regional trails was very important. So the Broadway redesign in Alexandria, Minnesota was completed in the fall of 2014. It ended up being what we're calling a complete streets reconstruction project in the downtown core. The design was intended to make the street safer, more pleasant, more convenient for all users. And what I really encourage all of you to do is if you Google it, you'll see a phenomenal video. Oh, I'm sorry, their population is 1,308. But what was even more interesting is they partnered up with Blue Cross Blue Shield of Minnesota to do a before and after performance measures of the project, and you can see this in the video. But what they learned is not only did the appearance increase, but pedestrian traffic increased, tourist traffic increased, and traffic safety increased. And you can see on the video that many of the business owners said, yes, we knew that it hurt when we were doing construction, but it's really paying off in the long run. And now they're seeing more local foot traffic, but also traffic diverted again from the trail to the downtown. So I highlighted both of these examples of kind of different size rural communities from 2,000 to 13,000 that have used complete streets really as ways to increase safety, reduce health disparities, but also really build up the economies within their community, and they are the rising stars within their communities. With that, and I will come back to talk more about kind of how to implement, but I'm lucky to turn it over to John Kaplan, who is with VTrans and also been a partner with the Complete Streets Coalition, who's going to give us an update there.
All right. Thank you very much, Emiko, and thanks to Kelly and AARP Vermont for inviting me to be part of this. And I've been a partner with AARP for really going all the way back to the beginning of our Complete Streets legislation here in Vermont. So it's nice to see it alive and well and you know, moving along. So I'm going to just try and focus in a little bit more. I think Emiko just did a great job of kind of setting the stage for what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to try to give a few examples of sort of how our small towns in Vermont can work towards complete streets. And I think, you know, one of the sort of, I guess, pitfalls that I think towns can fall into is, if you see like an image from a community that's really embraced this for a long period of time and they have some kind of a showcase project, sometimes that can be a little bit daunting because those kind of bigger projects can take, a long time and could take a fair amount of funding and commitment to get done. But there's also a lot of small improvements that can be made that have a big impact. So one of the things I also want to mention is that Complete Streets really works in all size communities. All Vermonters want safety. They want to have a safe place to be able to walk, bike, and get around. And I went and looked up just a couple of quick statistics. We have through our other state agency, the Commerce and Community Development Agency, they have the designated downtown and village center programs, and there's 124 designated village centers in Vermont. And really those village centers have the density and land use mix that really helps to support walking and biking. And as Emiko pointed out already, Complete Streets really can help communities support their economic development work as well. And there's a lot of different opportunities to work on Complete Streets and making streets better for everybody. One, of course, is transportation projects like paving or when a road gets rebuilt. But there's also other opportunities like when there's some utility work that's happening. I know a number of communities that are looking at putting in sidewalks at the same time as they are working on like water and sewer lines and drainage infrastructure. So that's just pointing out that there's other opportunities to be thinking about how can we sort of piggyback on an existing project, and that is often a way to make that more kind of cost effective at the same time. And then as developers come through and are developing parcels, if that's another opportunity to, if you have sort of an overall plan, say for a sidewalk network, is require developers to build the section of sidewalk that's in front of their, whatever they're developing. And there's a number of Vermont communities that are doing that, and over time that does work to build out the network. So it's just another opportunity for towns to be aware of. So I'm just going to get into a few specific examples of some what I think are kind of the low-hanging fruit ideas, things that are fairly easy to implement and fairly low cost that can have a big positive impact. So this one is pretty straightforward. It's just when roads are repaved or reconstructed is to narrow the travel lanes. There's a lot of 12-foot travel lanes around Vermont. That sort of was the industry standard for a long time. There's actually some good safety research now that shows that a 10 or 11-foot travel lane at 40 miles an hour or less is actually safer than a wider lane. So there's some real safety benefits to that. And just moving that edge line in by a foot or two without any additional widening results in a wider shoulder where people can walk or bike, especially in the more rural settings. And then if you have enough width and it's more of a built-up area, then marking the shoulder as a bike lane, if you have 4 feet or 5 feet if it's next to on-street parking, then putting in these bike symbols really indicates to bicyclists, here's your space on the road. It also indicates to people in vehicles that, to expect bicyclists there. It's a fairly low-cost improvement. So I have the cost here at $65 to $100 per set of these bike symbols, and this has a real safety benefit. So overall, it's a 35% reduction in crashes when you put in bike lanes. Some of these things are just basic maintenance. So once you have a facility, it is important to maintain it because it's fine to mark a bike lane, but then if gravel accumulates there, it ends up forcing the bicyclist back out into the travel lane. So in addition to providing facilities in the first place, making sure that they're maintained well is also important. And again, none of these are particularly sort of glamorous projects, but all these small improvements do add up. As far as signs go, just using the fluorescent yellow-green background, which is the signs in this picture show that background. That's a requirement for school signs, which these ones happen to be, but it can be used for other bike and pedestrian warning signs, and that's just a really low, really there's no added cost to changing the background color of the signs and helps to make them more visible. There's some other things you can do around signs, like adding the sort of the same color as the sign background as a strip on the sign post, just to enhance their visibility. And again, this is kind of a maintenance issue, but where that red circle is, there's actually a pedestrian sign sort of behind those tree branches. So making sure that signs are visible once you put them up. Again, it's kind of a maintenance issue that helps to keep everything safe. Just providing marked crosswalks. This is a fairly low-cost improvement. This block pattern, which is shown here, that's what our agency uses as a standard, and really that's the most visible crosswalk marking that's available. Again, relatively low cost, and marking crosswalks results in a 40% reduction in pedestrian crashes. So kind of these ideas hopefully are sort of the big bang for the buck type of ideas that will work to make the streets more complete. And as far as the relationship between on-street parking and crossing, or crosswalks rather, right in front of that white van on the right, there actually is a pedestrian who's trying to cross the road there, and because the parking got marked so close to the crosswalk, that's not, well, first of all, it's if it were at an intersection, that wouldn't be legal. You can't mark parking within 20 feet of crosswalks at intersections by Vermont law. And we follow that same practice for mid-block crosswalks because it just makes it hard for pedestrians to be seen, and it makes it hard for them to see traffic to know when there's a gap. There's other improvements for crosswalks, such as the in-street pedestrian sign. These are fairly low cost and pretty effective at getting drivers' attention, so just to help highlight existing crosswalks. Pedestrian refuge islands, these are a great benefit for pedestrians getting across the road safely. It breaks up that crossing of 2 or more lanes into kind of one direction at a time, giving pedestrians a safe place to wait for the gap in traffic coming the other direction. These are especially useful if there's a multi-lane crossing. So again, relatively low cost and a big safety benefit from installing these. Adding in bulb outs at intersections. This example is in Northfield. This is a project that actually I worked with the town way back, like probably 10, 15 years ago. They were looking at doing this at this intersection, and they did sort of a trial with just some cones to see how drivers would react and make sure they got the design right so that trucks and other traffic could still get around these the corners. And it's really nice to see that they followed through and ended up making this a permanent improvement. So bulb outs really help shorten the crossing distance for pedestrians, make the pedestrian more visible, give them a better line of sight to the vehicles. And it also has a traffic calming benefit of slowing traffic down as it comes through. This is right in the heart of Northfield's downtown. Probably a lot of people are familiar with these rectangular rapid flashing beacons. They've become pretty popular in Vermont. They are a great enhancement to an existing crosswalk if you're having some trouble with driver compliance, or you have a particularly vulnerable pedestrian population like young kids or elderly that are using a crosswalk. It's a push-button activated flashing beacon that's very visible. These signs are really bright if you've seen them out there. And then just providing sidewalks where they're needed. So a lot of times you'll see what I call kind of the goat trail, where pedestrians are already walking but there's no facility, is a big indication that there probably should be a sidewalk here. And adding a sidewalk getting to be a little bit more of a complex project, but really is relatively straightforward and has a big safety benefit for pedestrians. And then transit facilities. So if you compare the two stops shown in these slides, the one on the left really has no area for pedestrians, no connection to any other existing sidewalks, compared to the one on the right, which has a shelter so transit users can be out of the elements while they're waiting. It has a bike rack. If they happen to have arrived at this stop by bike, they can leave their bike locked up there. And so this transit stop is going to be much more attractive and usable by anybody who wants to take the bus. And then winter maintenance is definitely another consideration for sidewalks. And it's good to provide the pedestrian facilities, but also have to plan to maintain them in the winter because people need to walk places year-round. And that really gets to be an accessibility or an ADA issue. So just something else to consider. So just kind of one sort of rehash of this idea, but opportunities for installing bike lanes, really take a look when a paving project is coming up at what are the existing lane widths out there, how many lanes are there, are they really all needed from a traffic perspective. There are a number of roads in Vermont that are really kind of overbuilt for the amount of traffic that they're getting, and that's sort of the idea of a road diet, which is probably a topic for a whole other webinar, but the idea there is eliminating travel lanes when they're not needed, and maybe putting in things like two-way left turn lanes. And that gives an opportunity to use some of that leftover space to add in bike lanes. We actually did that on a project recently in the town of Berlin, and this was a good collaborative project where the town had done some planning to make the corridor better for biking and walking. We had a paving project coming along. Federal Highway had some incentives for us to try a road diet, and we eliminated a travel lane in each direction on this pretty busy road. And that allowed us to put in the buffered bike lanes that you see here in the picture on the right. So there's a painted space between the bikes and where the cars are traveling. Then certainly streetscape projects. These pictures are from downtown St. Albans, a little bit bigger community in Vermont. They did a large streetscape project which included water, sewer, traffic signals, sort of the whole 9 yards, and they did a lot of work with making the pedestrian environment work better, and that has been hugely popular, and they've seen a lot of private investment that actually followed the public investment of making the road better, with new businesses moving in, restaurants having outdoor seating and things like that. And then kind of another sort of small scale improvement is just providing secure bike parking in downtowns and at places like schools and other public buildings. So again, sometimes it's the small details that help make the street more complete. Just a real quick plug, we do have a small scale grant program to do some of those smaller improvements. That application comes out in April, so just keep your eyes open for that. And with that, I think I am handing it back to Kelly for some questions, possibly.
Great. Thank you so much, John. I really appreciate it. And to Emiko as well. I loved hearing the examples from Warsaw and Alexandria, especially about how Blue Cross Blue Shield got involved in the assessment. And John, thanks so much for some of those more up-to-date stats around reducing the impact of crashes. We do have a question that came in from Dean, and his question is really about what do you do when you're stuck with a highway director who isn't supportive of complete streets overall, such as they're going to be that you have a highway director who is advocating more for widening the local highways and isn't supportive of introducing fog lines, and just I think one of the challenges is culture there. And I want to open that up to John and Emiko and to Karen, for that matter, to perhaps share some light on that and maybe some of your experience that you've had dealing with people who are a little bit reluctant to embrace complete streets.
Sure, this is Emiko. Why don't I give more of a national overview to start, if that works, because I do get the privilege of working in a lot of states. I think that question is not uncommon, and in a way, complete streets is a different approach than a lot of people are familiar with. And one of the things I think we have found is successful is kind of meeting people where they are in terms of most engineers, and John is an engineer, I think we prioritize safety. And when you're able to agree on a safety message, getting to agreement on safety, and I don't think most transportation engineers would not agree that we're trying. They are not, there's safety and then there's capacity and delay. And I think probably some of your biggest issues in Vermont have to do less around capacity and delay, unless you're in cities like Burlington, and it has to do with safety. But once that, and with capacity and delay, I think being able to really speak with data has been a really important tool. And then asking, being able to, let's look at the data, and then asking whether that highway director, whoever they are, is willing to try out some things that might not be permanent. And moving kind of beyond tactical urbanism, but let's put in something for 3 months, and let's measure the before and after, and let's see what happens. Like, let's try it out. There's a lot of really cool new kind of materials available that do more temporary measures that go beyond 1 or 2 days, so we can test out things and say, hey, we're gonna measure this. We're gonna do before and after data. We're gonna also do some qualitative surveys of how people feel using it, and we're gonna look at the safety data. And that has been one of the most successful ways we have seen the conversation move. But I'll turn it to John or Karen, who might want to give a more local Vermont perspective.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned safety, because that was going to be the first thing that I was going to say is, I think that is the right way to approach it. And like I had on that one slide, there is some good research now that shows that at 40 miles an hour or under, that there is kind of a sweet spot of, I think the exact number is maybe around a 10.5-foot lane, that getting narrower than that starts to compromise safety, but actually, wider than that has a negative safety impact on all users, not just bicyclists necessarily. And I think too, with our constrained, we are dealing with a lot of constrained right-of-ways where you have either existing buildings or some natural feature, river or mountain that's a constraint. And so working within those existing footprints means balancing everything, and that's what Complete Streets is really about. It's yes, truck traffic still needs to travel on a road, but I think often people tend to go to that sort of worst case scenario, just using turning radius as an example. I think there is a tendency for engineers to think that all traffic always has to make a particular turn from their lane into their lane on the receiving end of the turn. Well, if that's like one truck every couple of weeks, why make that radius super wide so they can make that move when they're doing it once every couple of weeks, and the other 99% of the time you've now made it less safe for everybody else. So I think it's kind of thinking all of those things through.
That's a great point, John, just setting priority. And I also just want to let folks know, too, in regards to opportunity to engage the community as much as possible to be able to build that support as well. And AARP provides walk audits out in communities. We have a great group of trained volunteers that can help any community conduct a walk audit and then be able to really build that case and make the case for why it's so important for all modes. Before we get over to our next presenter, Karen, I do want to just also put this question out there for John. What is the process for small towns to be able to take over the ownership of the highway that goes through their town center?
All right, so that's a good question. Yeah, in Vermont we have this thing known as a Class 1 town highway, and there are a number of communities in Vermont that where it's a state-numbered route that goes through the center of town as Main Street, but some portion of that state route are actually under the jurisdiction of the town, and that's known as a Class 1 town highway. The exact process I'm a little unclear about, but I do know that it has to ultimately go through the legislature. I certainly can, get more information about that, and I know that our planning division of VTrans put together a few years ago a white paper about Class 1 town highways, which I'm sure is on the VTrans website, which there are some financial pros and cons, because towns actually get more money from the state as part of their regular allotment of funding that comes based on the miles of Class 1, 2, and 3 town highways in each town. But then the towns are responsible for maintaining that section of road in terms of the winter maintenance. The state still will repave it every 10 years or so, but that white paper kind of goes through some of the pros and cons. The pros are, from a Complete Streets perspective, is that because the town is maintaining that road now, you can do things like add crosswalks, narrow travel lanes down to whatever the town needs for a plowing width, as opposed to what VTrans needs, which is kind of we do have a little bit of a one-size-fits-all in terms of our plowing width, because we don't have a variety of trucks that we deploy for winter maintenance. So there are some real advantages to taking over a section of road as a Class 1 town highway.
Great. Thank you so much, John. All right, we'll get back to some of the other questions at the end of the webinar, but I want to go forward and introduce our next speaker, who is Karen Horne. She is the Director of Public Policy and Advocacy with the Vermont League of Cities and Towns. Welcome, Karen.
Hi, thank you. And can you hear me?
We sure can, thanks.
Okay. I wanted to respond to just a couple of the questions that were made. And I think with respect to road commissioners and so forth, really a major consideration is the cost of making improvements. And so to the extent that you can start small, as Amika recommended, that might be a good way to get the conversation rolling and to get some actual improvements made in a small area at fairly low cost to the municipality, and then you'll see how that goes. I did want to emphasize to folks that the Complete Streets program really feeds into ongoing efforts in an awful lot of municipalities around the state to grow the economy and to develop downtowns that are accessible to the elderly and to the very young and to people using all different kinds of modes of transportation. It's the improvements that you make, any one of these that have been highlighted here, are improvements that are going to benefit everybody who's in a community, and it's going to benefit all kinds of the motorized, walking, bicycling, walking to school public. And that's one of the things that I find is really enticing about the whole Complete Streets program. We are one of the fittest states in the nation. That's one of our good ratings that we get year after year. But it's very true that if you are looking at the whole health of your community, that these kinds of improvements, sidewalks, bicycle lanes, and so forth, are really going to help with that whole health for your city or town. I think also in Vermont we have some really excellent outdoor recreation opportunities, but they're not accessible to everyone. But you can always take a walk down the street if there's a sidewalk. And so that does expand the availability of those kinds of opportunities to your whole population. And then lastly, I think that making these kinds of improvements, making it clear on the ground that it's safe to walk or to bicycle or whatever you're doing in terms of your mode of transportation really increases your community's profile as being inviting and open to all kinds of users. So that's really all I wanted to say. We at the Vermont League of Cities and Towns can talk to you if you're interested in the kinds of improvements that John and Emiko indicated. And if you don't want to call John Kaplan first, you could call over here first, and we could try to help you get the information that you need. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much. Thanks, Karen. Go ahead, Emiko.
Great. Well, thank you, Kelly and Karen. I'm going to wrap this up by just talking about kind of things to think about when you're implementing Complete Streets. I think John gave a really good overview of kind of the tools that you can use. And what I want to stress is really what this looks like at the network level. Quick little technical thing, just trying to get, let's see. Kelly, would you mind sharing what slide is up for you right now?
Sure. I've still got Karen's slide up right now. I'm not quite sure why it's not advancing.
Yeah, me too. Mine isn't moving over. Okay.
That's interesting because it advanced on what I'm seeing has advanced.
Oh, sorry about that. I just wanted to make sure people knew that what I was talking about. So, what they're ultimately, I think John gave a really good overview of the different tools that are available to all in Vermont. And I wanted to actually take it up a level and talk about really when you are building out Complete Streets for rural communities, small towns, mid-sized cities, and big cities, what you're really trying to do is create a network. And I think about this as you're really creating networks of opportunities so that kind of regardless of who you are or how you choose or want to travel, you can get there in a safe, affordable, reliable, convenient way in a reasonable amount of travel time. This doesn't mean that you are putting those treatments on every street, and I think this is even more pressing in rural communities because you actually have far fewer streets and maybe far fewer resources. But the way that I think about this is, your first effort might really be to build out that main street, but then thinking about ways to connect people to the main street, have people move to the main street, so ultimately you have better networks. And that's when you really start to get in these networks that people can access all these things. We've seen this in a lot of places. So what I wanted to share with you is a slide that shows some of the I think we're having a little bit of technical difficulties, but a slide, so I'll talk more about this. So things to consider when you are building out this network and some tools available. So really when you're trying to build a network, you are thinking about how cohesive the network is. So these are questions you might be wanting to ask. You're going to be thinking about how accessible is this network. You're going to want to be thinking about the safety and the comfort of all of these. And so what that means is there's a series of questions that you want to ask as you're going through this. Oh, and I think we're getting our slides back up. So again, that's not about building a single trail, sidewalk, or bike lane, but that you're eventually building a whole network of opportunities. So what I have in front of you is the questions to ask when you're building the network. And so why I bring this up is that as you're planning, I want to think about all these questions. The other thing that I really wanted to emphasize as we're thinking particularly about small towns and rural areas is this issue of speed. Speed is something that we have been finding is a really, really important and unfortunate factor in fatalities. And I mentioned earlier, but so I believe the statistic is over 50% of traffic fatalities happen in rural communities. Although rural communities only represent 20% of the population, and I think that's largely in part because we have you have really roads that are built for high speeds. As I biked down, what is it? Highway? Is it 100? What would I have biked down? I think it would have been 100. As I went down 100 on the east side of the Green Mountains, if I had been hit, I would have died because of those really high speeds. And that's okay. I mean, that's not okay. But what you're thinking about is that road is a two-way, and you want to think about as a network building out really, you want two places, and you want through places, and then you want two places. But speed kills. A report came out from the NTSB, the National Traffic Safety Board, earlier this year that really kind of confirmed that we know that speed kills. And so what we want to focus on is, as you're doing all these treatments, thinking about that safety angle as well. So how you build in safety through all of that. So how do you do that? Well, John showed a lot of really good examples of how you do that through the different treatments that are available. So you're thinking about two things. You're thinking about how do I build this network, and how do I control for speed? And we build a network for economic reasons, for safety reasons, for sustainability reasons, for livability reasons. And then really I think this comes down to, and speed has to be a big part of it. About a year ago, so in December of 2016, the Federal Highways Administration contracted with Alta Planning to put out the Small Towns and Rural Areas Design Guidelines. And I apologize, we are trying to work on pulling up the slide, but I'll kind of talk through these. But I encourage everyone, and we'll make sure that we follow up with a link to this. But this guideline really starts to introduce ways that you can build that network and control for speed based on the type of roadway you're going to do. And it's all targeted at rural communities and small towns. So what we see is, you might have what's called a real yield roadway, which is a very, you probably have a lot of these in your community. So they're all residential, there's low speed, low traffic. You're trying to build residential connections. I grew up on a road like this. We had no sidewalks. We also didn't need a sidewalk because the speeds were so low and the volumes were so low. So that's one way that you can think about it. But then you might think about bringing in a bicycle boulevard in some of your streets. So it really becomes a shared road where you're building sharrows, and there's wayfinding so people realize it's a bike boulevard. Paved shoulders, and there are things I think you could even do as you're connecting communities to take advantage of some of your really good shoulders to just start to build more of a buffer. I'll go back to that slide where I just showed outside of Breckenridge, Colorado. They had painted it red. I was also recently, a few months ago, biking in about Central Virginia, and what they did is they actually had a two-way visually separated bikeway on a state road in Virginia that they just put temporary bollards up, those kind of temporary plastic sticks. They look like toothpicks. And so when it's snowy, they'll be able to take those out and plow over them. But that really, and they didn't do it across the entire bikeway, but they chose to do that at curves and places where people wouldn't necessarily see the cyclists. And then there's getting those shared use paths, which you have so many good shared use paths. And so it's really starting to map up all of those. So really the takeaway and implementation when you're in rural areas and small towns is that I think you're thinking about the amazing treatments that I think first you're thinking about your vision and really going back to what Karen talked about and some of those examples that I gave around using this as an economic tool and a way to address health and a way to really engage the community. And the ways to do this are start thinking about ways that you can not just build single streets, but really complete networks so that everyone, regardless of who they are, how they travel, has a safe, reliable, affordable, convenient way to move about in a reasonable amount of travel time. You're looking at different ways to do this in rural areas, so you're using the treatments John offered, but also thinking about building those networks with some of the tools that FHWA has just offered, because they don't always, and what's so great about this guide is they're not often very costly interventions. Some of them are. Creating a separated side path might be. But often whether it's striping or using a little bit of paint, you can do that. And then overcoming those barriers by starting to really speak to people what they care about. If it's an engineer, they care about safety. If it's a family, they probably care about their children getting safely to school, businesses and elected officials caring about economic development. But we're really lucky that I think Complete Streets has been something that rural communities have been successful about, because it's not a design prescription. It doesn't require a high amount of cost. And at the end of the day, it's something that really your vision of your community can be reflected in. It looks like we are about time, and I apologize again that it seems that our software would have gone down, but I will go ahead and make sure that this presentation is sent out to all of you. And with that, I want to thank you all, and I'm going to turn it back to Kelly.
Great. Thank you so much, Emiko, Karen, and John. Really appreciate it. And we are sorry that there was some technical difficulty, but we'll make sure we stay in the loop. We have a couple minutes left, and I just wanted to put a question out there that came up through the chat box, and I'm going to ask John to answer this. It's in regards to what's the recommended width for a bike lane, and is it 4 feet, and does that include the buffer? That's one question. And then the other question goes along the lines of what do you do in really narrow with narrow streets through village centers, and how do you accommodate all users in that type of case?
All right, good questions. So the minimum bike lane width is 4 feet, and that's just the area for the bikes. And that's when you're not next to any on-street parking. Once you're next to on-street parking, it should be at least 5 feet. And that does not include the buffer. So the buffer would be extra width you would need between the edge of the bike lane and where the travel lane is. And so that buffer width can vary, but typically it's not less than 2 feet. So if you had 4 feet plus an extra, in fact even with 4 feet plus an extra 2 feet, it might be better just to mark it as a 6-foot wide bike lane, for example. And that the resource that Emiko is mentioning, the Federal Highway resource, Small Town and Rural Multimodal Networks, is really a state-of-the-practice guidebook from Federal Highway that is a great resource for small towns. There's tons of treatments in there that really would work well for in Vermont. I've already been using that with several communities. I think the other question had to do with just very narrow roads. So, in some ways, that has kind of some built-in traffic calming to it, because the space is so minimal that everyone has to go at a much slower speed. And obviously you're not going to carve out bike lanes if your car lanes are already down to 9 feet. So there is actually, I think Emiko had some slides I see sort of illustrating what's called a yield roadway, and this Federal Highway Guide, the Small Town and Rural Multimodal Networks Guide, has some guidance about the sort of conditions that you have to have in order to make a yield roadway work. But essentially, even oncoming cars might have to pull over so that one car can get past, which is kind of a radical idea, but it can work with the right conditions.
Great. Thank you, John. And as we near 1 o'clock, I'm going to close out the webinar and thank everybody for joining us this afternoon. And hopefully that you have gained some good perspective and some ideas for inspiration. And just want everybody to know that you can reach myself, John Kaplan at B-Trans, and Karen Horne at the Vermont League of Cities and Towns for any help or assistance with the work out in your community. So thank you so much for joining. I'm going to say goodbye.